an episode on world geopolitical trends. Why not? Yeah. In the spirit of always making episodes about something which I know nothing about. A Ryanair airliner was diverted over the last few hours over Belarus, where the Belarusians are. There was a journalist on there that Belarus wanted to arrest and no doubt shoot. I'm not saying they're going to shoot him, but I bet they want to. Belarus. So, as I always do, just Google a couple of things, like where the hell's Belarus? and the first thing I see is that Belarus is part of a supra nation that comprises itself and Russia. So Russia and Belarus are aligned, joined together as a supra nation. There's a supra nation, and it's called the Union State or something like that. Similar to the United States, let's say, but it's more in the form of the European Union or something like that, which is a supranational sort of entity or state, and the African Union, which is a supranational organisation. As soon as I read that Belarus and Russia are voluntarily joined together as a supra nation, still independent nations. Supra means above. Okay, so they're independent and yet connected into one. They're many and they're separate. They're one and they're many at the same time. And as soon as I heard that word supra, I said, hang on, I've heard that word recently. And I did hear it because I've been listening to an audio book or an audio lecture actually on geopolitics, and geography really, and geopolitics. And within these lectures I've been listening to, the lecturer, I really like he's an American, the guy giving these lectures, but I actually like his accent. I don't hate all American accents. Some of them are very listenable. I like this guy. I use him to go to sleep too. He's very relaxing. And in the morning, we start off talking about New Guinea or something, and in the morning I wake up, we're still talking about New Guinea, and he's in Belarus or somewhere. Anyway, he talks about trends, the way the world's going and all that sort of thing, population growth, population leveling out. He mentioned that at one stage, that population is going to probably level out at some stage, and so on and so forth. Yeah. And then double later down the track, he's got all this modelling and all that sort of stuff. But the point is, for the purposes of this episode, which is about supranations, like this Union State or whatever it's called, comprising the Belarusians and the Russians, scary lot. They brought down a Ryanair plane, an Irish plane. They tricked the Irish into landing. That wasn't hard. They said there's a free Guinness on the tarmac. No, they said there was a bomb threat, but there wasn't. They just wanted to arrest a guy. That's the Russians for you, and the Belarusians too. All right. Piracy, that is. And they took him away. Bang! That'll be the end of him. All right. Now, supranations. This geography lecturer I've been listening to suggests that there are multiple forces all going on all at once in the world, in terms of geopolitics, but he said one trend is a trend towards fragmentation of states, if you like, into their component, what you might call ethno-nationalist components, states, portions. So, like take the United Kingdom, which is something of a supra state itself. It's not a state, the United Kingdom, although you could argue it is, but it's actually, well, even the people in the United Kingdom, they refer to the 4 nations of the United Kingdom. There's 4 different nations. So it's not one nation, it's 4 nations. But one supra state, one union, one kingdom, one united kingdom, metaphor states. But that, looks on the verge, it's always looking on the verge of fragmenting. Prince William came out just yesterday and said, "Oh, I love Scotland so much, and my mother does too. My mother did, and my father loves it, and everybody loves it, and that's where I proposed to my wife. I love that joint." And what he's doing there is, Parliament's been in his ear and asked him to say a few words in the direction of the idea of the Scots not seceding, but that's what's going on there, So there's pressure on the United Kingdom to fragment. Now Yugoslavia has already fragmented. Actually, this fragmentation, this trend, this sort of, this looking for the right system for the right time. The right system for the 2021s, the 2020s, is different than the right system for the 1940s or something like that. There was a time when ethno-nations were trying to sort of coalesce into bigger nations, but now fragmentation is on by the look of it. So what else have you got? So you had Yugoslavia breaking up into all the Balkan states, and this fragmentation is called balkanization. I think I've heard that term before, but it's called balkanization. So you've got this trend where there's pressure on what you might call superstates, not supra, but superstates. The one that comes to my mind is Ethiopia, because I've got a goddaughter who's very interested in Ethiopia, and that's kind of a state made up of a number of nations, as you might call it, forced together, so to speak, into one big multinational state. And there's pressure right now, I think, within this super state called Ethiopia to fragment or to balkanize into a number of nations, into a number of ethnic nations. There's people trying to stop that, of course, but there's a lot of talk about that. And what else is trying to fragment? I'm sure there's other places trying. Well, Sudan has fragmented into South Sudan and North Sudan. And from what I hear of South Sudan, that could fragment even further. I don't think it will, but I've heard that's, there's different groups within South Sudan that are so different from each other that, one can imagine that fragmenting into Southwest Sudan and Southeast Sudan and a whole lot of other little Sudans. What else is trying to fragment? Is there anywhere else trying to fragment? Australia is not really trying to fragment. But if Indigenous Australians weren't so in the minority, I'm sure that Australia would fragment into about 600 nations in no time, So I think balkanization is a trend. There is a pressure for states that are kind of too big, to fragment into smaller parts. But here's the funny thing. At the same time, there's pressure on these now independent states. Let's say Ethiopia, broke into whatever, 6 ethno nations or whatever, groupings. at the same time as it did that, and you've got other nations around there like Eritrea and a few others too, and South Sudan maybe, or North Sudan, well, which is called Sudan. Why didn't they get called North Sudan? They just grabbed Sudan. That's like South Australia, Western Australia, and Victoria. Yeah, we've got South Australia, Western Australia, and Victoria. We should just call ourselves Australia. Here in Victoria, we're Australia. And over there's South Australia, to our west, and further over to the west is Western Australia, but we're Australia. We could change our name from Victoria to Australia using the Sudan method. All right, but at the same time, let's just imagine. See, Somalia. That's another one that wants to fragment into Somaliland and Somalia, and a few other little chunks as well. Right, imagine it all fragmented, the Horn of Africa, for example. I could have used the example of Yugoslavia too, but that one's done and dusted. Okay, so we've got a new one here, Ethiopia, let's say. At the same time as, two forces might happen at once. A pressure for the entire Horn of Africa to fragment, but at the same time, for all those fragmented pieces, these smaller nations, to coalesce again, keep their independence. They're all nation states, but for them to form a supranational state of, the state of Horn, the state of the Horn of Africa, for example, and then for that supranational state to be maybe a part of the African Union, which is a supra national state, and this is the trend. This is maybe a trend in the world at present. Is there anywhere else I can think of that's trying to break up? Well, obviously I mentioned the United Kingdom. Spain, Catalonia could break off. But then, if Catalonia, or whatever they call it, broke off, and then there was Spain proper and Portugal, the Iberian Peninsula could become the supranational state of Iberia. And if Northern Ireland broke off and didn't become part of Ireland, isn't it funny how, you see what I'm talking about? It should be South Ireland, shouldn't it? They could, they could even be separate nations, because you're not going to change all those bloody Protestants up in Northern Ireland into Catholics overnight. So you could have two different nations, Northern Ireland and Ireland, but they could be part of a supra-nation called Hibernia. And Scotland and England and Wales could join together to become Britannia, and we could be back in Rome in no time. So on and so forth. Italy could do with some breaking up. It's been a basket case since World War II. You could break that right up, back into its component parts. Everything it was before Garibaldi and all that sort of stuff. And we could go back to the two Sicilies, Genoa and all that sort of stuff, and Rome, Calabria and all these places. And but then you could, at the same time, and the supranational state wouldn't have to be have the same borders as the old Italy. There was a trend back in 1848 or whatever it was. When the German states, Prussia and all those ones, and Westphalia and all those, all joined together to become a super state of Germany, and then all the Italian mini-states got their independence from Austria or whatever, and then got trapped into Italy, and so on and so forth. Right, the reverse might be on, and we might have, we could see Germany break up again, but then immediately coalesce again into a German supra-state. Let's say the EU falls apart, you could get a supra-state going, a Germanic supra-state, which might actually include Austria, for example. Let's get the old Austro-Hungarian Empire back together again, could we? That could happen. So Italy could break up, and then there could be a supranational Italian state, but it would be different than the super-state that is Italy. because all the different nations like Genoa and all the other ones I mentioned, they would all be genuine countries, So it's because it's more natural. We want to break up into our component parts. Traffic going past. Daughter. On one level, we'd like to break up into 10,000 nations again, all around the world. But at the same time, we want the economic benefits of coalescing. Now, the economic benefits of coalescing were realised back in the 1800s, especially by smashing ethnic states, such as throughout Italy, and crushing them in, and then smashing them into a single super state. But maybe technology, for example, might be aiding all of this. It's possible for us to all fragment and not be so centralised and all that sort of stuff. Thanks to technology, the internet and all that sort of stuff, you can do business from home. You don't need to cluster into cities and have it's technology may be making balkanisation, fragmentation more possible. So technology could usher in a Back to the Future kind of scenario where we all fragment back into our component ethnic parts, or if not ethnic, cultural parts or whatever. But at the same time, we still need the economic benefits of coalescence. There are many problems that can't be dealt with by too many nations acting in their own self-interest alone. Again, I'm thinking of Ethiopia because of the Locust Problem. That requires a combined effort of many, many nations, many nations that aren't getting along all that well right now, and that's why the Locust Problem isn't being dealt with very well. But best of both worlds style, yes. Maybe the trend in the future will be towards people fragmenting into their cultural identity groups or ethnic identity groups and all that sort of thing, as a rule. And we might end up with, what have we got now? Nearly 200 countries. We might end up with 1,000 countries, and I think that'd be rather nice. And I think it actually is even possible, and especially made possible by the information age. We can fragment things. Where we needed a great big office building in the city, let's call it a company. Let's take the idea of a company, for example, where you needed everybody in the big 18-storey building back in the old days. Well, a company can just fragment right across Australia and the world now and still operate, courtesy of the information age. So countries could do the same. The economies of scale that forced small ethnic nations to combine into supernations back in the old days, supernations such as, for example, Italy and Germany, which I think are two exciting ones, the way those came about. That could be shoved into reverse now, and all the nations of the world could come back. We could fragment back into all those original nations of the world, some of which will never, some were wiped out and can't come back. The language is gone, so on and so forth. I think many languages in Italy were wiped out by Italian unification. That's what they called it. But it was actually the cultural genocide of all the separate Italian identities into one, arguably. Many languages were lost, and so on and so forth. So, two things could be happening at the same time, and they're kind of opposite things. One, the balkanisation of larger states into smaller nations or smaller states that run along ethnic and cultural lines. A lot of that could happen in Africa, because a lot of those super states were artificial, imposed by Europeans and that sort of thing. It's been nothing but trouble. So if they could fragment, it wouldn't be a bad idea. But all of us could, So at the same time, fragmentation, and at the same time, coalescence. At the same time, but not coalescence back into supranations where everybody's got the same identity. The idea of a one Australia, or a one Africa. A lot of African Americans want a one Africa, but I think they're swimming against the tide of history. I think the tide of history is for somewhere like Africa to fragment into a million bits. And then for the African Union perhaps to become the supra nation that oversees all of that, but to have some semi-supra nations within Africa as well, under the African Union and all that sort of thing, form, like let's say a Horn of Africa supra nation. And a South African, small s South, South African supra nation. If it could split up into Zulus and Dutch and English and a few others down there too. All right. And the original Click people, they often get forgotten. South Africa could split up into all of that, but then coalesce again as a supranation that also brings in, places like Zimbabwe. That could happen. And the other joint over there, Namibia. They're the two trends. Now, they're the political trends. There's another supra-style organisation out and up and about in the world, and that is multinational corporations. And that's a whole other layer. But these things can coalesce. Coexist. End of episode.